The silence in the dining hall was a physical weight, thick and suffocating. 30 decorated officers sat frozen, their forks hovering over their plates. General Richard Blackwell, a man who seemed carved from granite and arrogance, had just called me filth. The word hung in the air, a poison meant just for me, delivered with a cruel, self-satisfied smile. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet, but years of training held my body still, my expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. I simply met his gaze, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Then, a chair scraped against the polished floor. My commander, Captain Eva Rostova, rose to her feet. She was a woman of quiet intensity, her presence commanding more respect than the general's bluster ever could. She looked directly at Blackwell, her voice dangerously calm as it sliced through the tension. "General," she said, each syllable a chip of ice. "Perhaps you weren't reading on Operation Nightingale." The general's face went slack. The smug confidence vanished, replaced by a sudden stark pallor as if he'd been struck. The name, a word he should never have heard, had changed everything in the room. It had all started 2 weeks earlier, at a painfully familiar family barbecue. My uncle, Mark, a retired sergeant first class who believes real soldiering ended when he did, was holding court by the grill. He saw me talking to a guest and swaggered over, throwing a heavy arm around my shoulder. "This is my niece, Anya," he announced with a patronizing chuckle. "She's in the army, too. Pushes pixels around Fort Meade. The geek squad in uniform." He was introducing me to a young, ambitious major, General Blackwell's personal aide. The major smirked, his eyes filled with the same casual dismissal I'd seen my whole life. "Oh, Cyber Command?" he asked, his tone making it clear it wasn't a real question. "So, you handle the general's IT tits?" I gave a vague, classified, friendly answer, but the damage was done. It wasn't just the sting of the words, it was the echo of 1,000 other moments. It was the memory of my father praising my cousin for simply enlisting, the Christmases, spent explaining that my work was more than playing on a computer. A narrative had been solidified, a seed of disrespect planted in the one circle where it could professionally destroy me. I wasn't a soldier, I was a joke. My uncle thought he was joking. He had no idea he'd just painted a target on my back for a man who believed the only real soldier was one covered in mud. To understand why one word at a dinner could end a general's career, you have to understand the war he couldn't see. To my family, honor was something you could see. It was a crisp uniform, a rifle slung over a shoulder, the dust of a training field. It had a sound, the sharp crack of a salute, the roar of a drill sergeant. My contributions, however, were silent. They existed in a world of abstractions, of encrypted data streams and invisible, digital defenses, and because they couldn't see it, they simply chose not to. This truth never felt more real than at Christmas. My cousin, fresh out of basic training, was the guest of honor, paraded around the living room like a conquering hero. He had stories of mud and push-ups, of being broken down and built back up. He was tangible. He was real. My father, a man who always wanted a son to follow his infantry footsteps, raised a glass to him during dinner. His voice was thick with a pride I had never heard directed at me. To a real warrior he boomed, and the whole family cheered. Later, when I tried to share my own news, my voice felt small in the loud room. I mentioned I'd received a formal commendation for a complex network analysis that had taken me months to perfect. My father just gave my shoulder a patronizing pat, his eyes already scanning the room for someone more interesting to talk to. "That's nice, honey," he said with a dismissive smile. "Anything that keeps you safe behind a desk." The words didn't just sting. They erased me. It wasn't about safety, not really. It was about legitimacy. To him, my desk was a hiding place, not a battlefield. I became the keyboard kid, a nickname they all adopted with casual cruelty. And as my father turned away, I didn't just feel the sting of that one comment. I felt the weight of the guitar lessons I never got because money was tight. Only to watch them buy my cousin a new set of football pads a week later. I saw the busted laptop I had to replace myself during college. It was the same familiar dismissal, the quiet confirmation that my passions, my skills, they just didn't count on the family ledger. They were a hobby. His son was a warrior. My real world was a place they could never imagine. It was a sensitive, compartmented information facility. A skiff, buried deep in the bowels of Fort Meade. The air in there was always cold, kept at a constant 68 degrees, to protect the servers that hummed with a quiet, immense power. There were no windows. The only light came from the glow of a dozen monitors. The only sound was that constant, low hum and the click of my keyboard. This was my real home, my real proving ground. One night, that steady hum was shattered by a piercing digital alarm, a screeching klaxon that signaled a breach in the highest-level networks. My heart didn't panic. It found its rhythm. This was my element. My voice was calm, cutting through the sudden tension in the room. "They're using a polymorphic worm to bypass the EDR," I announced, my eyes already tracking the intrusion across a global map. "We've got a breach in the JSOC network." This wasn't about IT tickets. This was an active, sophisticated attack from a hostile state's elite hacking cell, and I was the lead analyst for the counterintelligence mission designed to stop them, Operation Nightingale. My commands were precise, unhesitating. Isolate the CENTCOM subnet. I need a full packet capture now. My commanding officer, Captain Eva Rostova, a woman who saw warfare as a grand chess match and valued intellect over brute force, stood behind me. She didn't hover or second guess. She just watched, her presence a silent affirmation of absolute trust. That trust was the antithesis of my family's doubt. As my fingers flew across the keyboard, executing a countermeasure I had designed weeks before, I felt more seen in that dark, cold room than I ever had in the warm light of my family's living room. With a final command, the hostile code was neutralized. The attack was over. I had just prevented the theft of active troop deployment data, shielding soldiers in the field from a catastrophic ambush. My desk job had just saved lives. General Richard Blackwell perfectly mirrored this disconnect between the person May was and the person Tha. He was the institutional embodiment of my father's prejudice. I'd watched him at a press conference on C-SPAN, standing at a podium, dripping with old guard disdain for the modern military. He was lobbying Congress to divert funding from Cyber Command, his voice booming with righteous conviction. He spoke of the need for more boots on the ground, dismissing the digital domain as a bloodless, honorless field of battle. His words were just a more polished version of my uncle's jokes and my father's dismissive pats on the head. Listening to him, I felt a familiar coldness. He and my father spoke different languages, one of policy and budgets, the other of paternal disappointment, but the core message was identical. My world was lesser. My skills were not valid. And the general's belief wasn't just an opinion, it was a tangible threat. His campaign to undermine Cyber Command put missions like Nightingale at risk. He wasn't just ignoring my world, he was actively trying to burn it down, to prove it was worthless. He was my family's lifelong disapproval, given a uniform, 2 stars, and the power to make his ignorance into policy. My family and the general saw the same thing, a quiet woman in a clean uniform. They couldn't comprehend that my battlefield was silent, my victories were classified, and my weapon was knowledge. It was a language they refused to learn, so I would have to force them to read the final report. For weeks, the general's existence was just a background hum of institutional disapproval, a louder, more powerful version of the condescension I'd known my whole life. But hearing the whispers from his aide, feeling the casual way my own family had painted me as a fraud, it all coalesced into a single, cold point of clarity. This was no longer a personal slight. General Blackwell's public disdain and his private lobbying were a direct and active threat to my unit's mission. He was trying to dismantle the very shield I was tasked with maintaining. His prejudice was about to have consequences far beyond my own hurt feelings. A quiet, calculated anger settled in my gut. It wasn't the hot, messy anger of a shouting match. It was the cold, focused fury of an analyst who has finally identified the root of a systemic problem. I decided then that I wouldn't seek revenge. That was an emotional, unpredictable variable. I would seek a procedural correction. I would use the very system of rules, of order, of precedence and honor that he held so sacred, and I would turn it against him. He believed in the power of the uniform and its traditions. So I would use tradition as my weapon. The opportunity arrived in a mass email. The announcement of the annual regimental dinner. General Blackwell was to be the guest of honor. It was perfect. I spent that night not stewing in anger but in research, my screen glowing. In the dark as I meticulously scrolled through Army regulations. I found it in AR 608-22, the section on award presentations. The protocol was clear. I walked into my CO's office the next morning with a plan. I didn't speak insults or feelings. I laid out the facts, my voice even. Captain, General Blackwell is undermining our operational security with his political maneuvering. An official public acknowledgement of Nightingale's success is necessary to protect our assets. I was speaking to Captain Eva Rostova, a razor-sharp intelligence officer, who had seen too many good missions sabotaged by political ego. She didn't need the subtext explained. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she processed the strategic implications, seeing the chessboard exactly as I did. A slow, knowing smile touched her lips. "He can't dispute a formal commendation," she said, her voice a low murmur of conspiracy. "Especially one he has to present himself." She understood immediately. This wasn't about revenge. It was about re-establishing the truth in a forum he couldn't escape. Captain Rostova handled the execution with bureaucratic precision. She submitted the full after-action report for Operation Nightingale, along with a request for a unit citation, through the proper unassailable channels. The request was a masterpiece of military paperwork, perfectly formatted and justified, citing the exact regulations that made it not only appropriate but necessary. She specifically requested the commendation be added to the agenda for the regimental dinner, citing the General's presence as a fitting opportunity to honor work that had occurred under his broader command. It was a perfect, procedural checkmate. There was no legitimate reason to deny it. The commendation was approved, a single line item on an agenda filled with pomp and tradition. General Blackwell would have seen it, dismissed it as a minor cyber award, and prepared his speech. He had no idea he was about to present the medal for the very operation that would prove he was obsolete. The regimental dining hall was a cathedral of military tradition. Generations of history seemed to soak into the dark wood-paneled walls, looking down from stern, oil-painted portraits. The air was thick with the scent of starched linen and old leather, punctuated by the gentle clinking of silver on porcelain. Officers in immaculate dress blues, their chests gleaming with medals that told stories of service and sacrifice, filled the room with a low, confident murmur. At my table sat my family, looking entirely out of their depth. My Uncle Mark was trying to look like he belonged, puffing out his chest, but his eyes were wide with a tourist's awe. They were impressed by the spectacle, by the surface of it all, but they were blind to the complex currents of rank, protocol, and power that flowed beneath. At the head table, General Blackwell held court. He was in his element, a lion in his den, basking in the deferential glow of his acolytes. He laughed, a loud, booming sound that commanded the attention of everyone nearby. To them, he was the embodiment of the warrior ethos, a living legend. To me, he was a relic, a man so enamored with the wars of the past that he couldn't see the one being fought right in front of him. He was the final boss of every dismissive comment, every patronizing smile I had ever endured. And he was about to give his keynote speech. He took the stage to thunderous applause, his presence filling the room. He began with the predictable platitudes, his voice a gravelly roar as he spoke of honor, courage, and sacrifice. He told old stories of grit and glory, of the valor of true warriors. Then, his tone shifted. A sneer crept into his voice as he began to rail against the changing face of warfare, making thinly veiled jabs at those who fought from behind a screen. I felt the eyes of his aide on me from across the room and knew with a cold certainty that this was for me. His gaze swept the crowd and then, like a predator locking onto its prey, it settled on me. The room seemed to shrink, the air growing thin. "We have service members who have never seen the sun," he began, his voice dripping, with contempt, "who think courage is finding a bug in a line of code." He paused, letting the insult hang in the air, ensuring everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. I felt my family shifting uncomfortably beside me. And then came the final, brutal blow. "Frankly," he spat, his eyes boring into mine, "that kind of filth doesn't belong in this uniform." A shocked, dead silence fell over the hall. It was a visceral thing, a complete void of sound. In that moment, a white-hot flash of fury surged through me, so intense it almost made me dizzy. But just as quickly, it was encased in ice. Years of discipline, of learning to control my emotional output, took over. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I simply held his gaze, my expression a perfect mask of military neutrality. My heart hammered against my ribs, but on the surface, I was a statue. Before the tension could break, the master of ceremonies, a flustered-looking, Colonel scrambled to the lectern, desperate to reclaim the agenda. "And now," he announced, his voice slightly strained, "the presentation of unit commendations." Captain Rostova rose and walked to the stage. Her steps were deliberate, her posture radiating a calm, unshakable authority that made the general's bombast seem cheap and hollow. She reached the lectern and adjusted the microphone, the room still holding its breath. She began to read the formal citation, her voice clear and strong, ringing with official weight. "For extraordinary meritorious service in the execution of operation." She paused. It was a masterful, calculated moment of dramatic tension. She lifted her eyes from the page and looked directly at General Blackwell, who was still standing near the stage, basking in the afterglow of his vicious attack. Nightingale. The code name detonated in the silent room. It was not a name known to most, but I saw it register instantly on the faces of a few senior intelligence colonels scattered throughout the audience. They visibly stiffened, their eyes widening in comprehension. Nightingale wasn't just another mission. It was a legendary, deeply compartmented counterintelligence operation that had been whispered about in the highest echelons for months. It was the operation that had successfully identified a high-level mole inside the Department of Defense. A mole whose intel leaks had directly resulted in the deaths of an entire Green Beret OTA team. General Blackwell's face became a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a waxy gray pallor. His arrogant smirk dissolved into a slack-jawed gape of disbelief. He understood. He knew exactly what was next. The citation continued, Captain Rostova's voice unwavering as she detailed how the lead analyst's work had not only stopped the devastating leak, but had also, in a brilliant act of predictive analysis, saved another Special Forces team from walking into a catastrophic ambush. A team that fell under General Blackwell's own operational command. The MC's voice then boomed over the speakers, making it official for the entire room to hear. For her pivotal role as lead analyst, the Army Commendation Medal is awarded to Lieutenant Anya Sharma. Every eye in the room swung from me to Blackwell. The air crackled with a new, delicious tension. The protocol was absolute. As the senior officer and guest of honor, he was required to present the award. There was no escape. He stood frozen for a moment, his public empire of arrogance crumbling into dust around him. Then, on visibly shaky legs, he began his walk of shame. Each step seemed to take a monumental effort. He was forced to approach the stage, to take the medal from the presenter, and to face the woman he had just publicly branded as filth. His hand trembled as he took the medal, his eyes refusing to meet mine. He fumbled with the clasp, his fingers clumsy, his breathing ragged. As he finally pinned the medal to my uniform, I looked past him, out at my family. My uncle's jaw was hanging open in stunned disbelief. And my father just looked completely, utterly, and devastatingly lost. He had built his entire identity on the valor of the men he commanded. In that moment, in front of everyone, he was forced to honor the woman whose filthy work had saved them. The dinner didn't end so much as dissolved. The moment General Blackwell was forced to pin that medal on my uniform, the carefully constructed facade of the evening shattered. The polite chatter died, replaced by a thick, awkward silence. There was no more applause, no more celebratory toasts. General Blackwell himself seemed to shrink, the arrogant bluster draining out of him, leaving behind a frail, defeated old man. His aide appeared at his elbow and quietly, without a word, escorted him from the room. It wasn't a dramatic exit. It was the quiet, ignominious end to a long and storied career, an erasure rather than a finale. His empire had crumbled, and it didn't even make a sound. As I turned to walk back to my table, something happened that I had never experienced before. The crowd of officers, these men of rank and prestige, parted for me. They cleared a path, their eyes filled with a new, profound respect. High-ranking colonels, men who wouldn't have given me a second glance, an hour before gave me quiet, knowing nods of acknowledgement. I had not just won an argument. I had been accepted. I had proven my worth in the only language that mattered in that room, the language of competence and mission success. When I finally reached my family, they were pale and silent. My uncle, the man of 1,000 war stories, couldn't even look at me. My father just stared, his expression utterly blank. They didn't speak. They didn't approach. They just looked at me as if I were a complete stranger. And I realized with a sad sort of finality that they were right. 3 months later, I sat at the head of a polished mahogany table in a secure briefing room. The view was different from here. The balance of power had fundamentally shifted. We learned that the Inspector General's office had launched a full investigation into Blackwell's command in the days following the dinner. His very public remarks, combined with the now revealed strategic importance of Operation Nightingale, painted a damning picture. What had once been dismissed as the gruff opinions of an old soldier was now seen for what it was: conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. His relentless campaign to defund and sabotage Cyber Command was no longer a policy debate, it was a politically motivated endangerment of mission-critical assets. The consequences were swift and severe, delivered in the cold, precise language of a formal military report. General Blackwell was formally censured, his pending promotion was revoked, and he was forced into an early, graceless retirement. His name, once a symbol of honor, was now a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of the Pentagon, a lesson in what happens when ego is allowed to eclipse duty. His legacy wasn't one of a great warrior, it was of a fool who was so obsessed with the wars of the past, he was blind to the battles that would define the future. With Blackwell gone, my own reality transformed. I was promoted to captain, and I was no longer just the lead analyst. I was given command of my own unit, the newly formed Analysis and Response Cell. My new commanding officer was a forward-thinking general, a man who saw the digital domain not as a bloodless, honorless abstraction, but as the primary battlefield of the 21st century. At high-level briefings, he would introduce me with a simple, powerful phrase. That meant more to me than any medal. "This is Captain Sharma," he would say. She was the architect of Nightingale. There was no condescension in his voice, only respect. My colleagues, my team, they became my true family. We were a unit forged not by blood or obligation, but by a shared, silent competence and a mutual understanding of the stakes. The quiet hum of the servers in our new command center was a more comforting sound than any forced family gathering had ever been. One afternoon, an email appeared in my inbox. The subject line was blank. The sender was my father. The message inside was short, just a few stilted words that felt like they had been typed and retyped a dozen times. I read an unclassified version of the report. It said, "We need to talk." I stared at the words on the screen, and I waited for the old feelings to surface, the anger, the hurt, the desperate need for his approval, but there was nothing. There was only a quiet, calm distance. I realized in that moment that my peace was no longer tied to his acknowledgement. My worth had been validated in the silent, serious rooms where it truly mattered. His opinion was just data, irrelevant data. I typed a single word in reply. No. I hit send, archived the message without a second thought, and turned back to the holographic threat map glowing on the main screen. My work, my true legacy, was waiting. General Blackwell believed honor was forged in fire and steel. I proved it could be coded in ones and zeros. If you've ever had your silent expertise dismissed by loud ignorance, tell us your story below. Here we value every line of code and every quiet victory.